In the fluorescent glow of an American supermarket in Houston, Texas, 1989, Soviet politician Boris Yeltsin stood transfixed. The shelves stretched endlessly before him, laden with thousands of products he had never seen or imagined. Fruits and vegetables of every variety and color, regardless of season. Dozens of types of breakfast cereals. An entire aisle dedicated solely to different brands of toothpaste. The future Russian president wandered through the store, picking up items, examining packaging, asking questions through his translator. Store employees, initially confused by the commotion, soon realized they were witnessing something profound, a man seeing abundance for the first time. Even the Politburo doesn't have this choice. Not even Mr. Gorbachev, Yeltsin reportedly said, visibly shaken. On the plane departing America, he was uncharacteristically quiet. Later, he would write that seeing that ordinary American supermarket had overwhelmed him. The prosperity wasn't just for the elite, it was for everyone. It was the moment that crystallized his growing doubts about the Soviet system, a turning point that would help propel the collapse of a superpower. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The encounter between Soviet citizens and American supermarkets in the 1980s wasn't just about food. It was about confronting fundamentally different worldviews. It represented the culmination of decades of Cold War propaganda, where each side had painted the other in stark, often cartoonish terms. For ordinary Soviet visitors, these moments created cognitive dissonance of the highest order. Their lifetime of education had taught them that capitalism produced scarcity for the masses and luxury for the few. The reality before their eyes told a different story. The Soviet Union of the 1980s was a land of scarcity by design. The centrally planned economy, focused primarily on heavy industry and military production, had never prioritized consumer goods. Russian historian Elena Zubkova documented how Soviet citizens would spend, on average, 14 hours per week standing in lines for basic necessities. By 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, the inefficiencies of the system had become impossible to ignore. His twin reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sought to revitalize Soviet socialism by introducing limited market mechanisms and greater transparency. These reforms unintentionally created the conditions for more Soviet citizens to experience the West directly. Delegations of officials, scientists, artists, and even ordinary citizens began traveling to the United States and other Western countries in numbers unimaginable just a few years earlier. What they saw challenged everything they had been told about capitalism. And nothing challenged their preconceptions more fundamentally than American supermarkets. The seeds of these encounters were planted decades earlier, in a kitchen in Moscow. On July 24, 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in what became known as the kitchen debate. Standing in a model American kitchen at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, they sparred over the merits of their respective systems. Nixon emphasized the variety of appliances available to ordinary Americans, while Khrushchev dismissed them as gadgets designed to separate Americans from their money. Would it not be better to compete in the relative merits of washing machines than in the strength of rockets? Nixon asked. The question encapsulated the American position. Capitalism produced abundance that improved everyday life. The Soviets had a different vision. Communism would eventually produce plenty for all, but military power and industrial might took precedence over consumer goods. For the next 2 decades, few Soviet citizens had opportunities to test these competing claims firsthand. The Iron Curtain remained firmly in place, with travel to the West restricted to high-ranking officials, select cultural delegations, and spies. The Soviet public relied on carefully curated propaganda about life in America, stories of unemployment, racial strife, homelessness, and exploitation. This began to change in the late 1970s when limited cultural and scientific exchanges expanded. By the early 1980s, as U.S.-Soviet relations deteriorated during President Reagan's first term, these exchanges slowed but didn't stop entirely. Then came Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985 and his radical reform agenda. Suddenly, the door to the West opened wider than at any time since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Igor Berman, a Soviet economist who emigrated to the United States in 1974, spent much of the 1980s analyzing Soviet living standards. His controversial findings suggested that the average Soviet citizen's real income was only 28% of an American's, a far cry from official Soviet statistics claiming near parity. But statistics couldn't capture the experiential reality of consumer life in the two superpowers. That required direct observation. Between 1958 and 1988, approximately 50,000 Soviet citizens visited the United States, according to State Department records. Many were part of official delegations, scientists attending conferences, performing artists on cultural tours, athletes competing in international events, and government officials on diplomatic missions. A smaller number were journalists stationed in America or students on academic exchanges. By the late 1980s, limited tourism became possible for a privileged few with family connections abroad or access to scarce hard currency. For these Soviet visitors, regardless of their status or purpose, American supermarkets often became an unexpected highlight of their trip, a mundane feature of American life that nonetheless held profound implications for how they understood the Cold War's competing systems. Ilya Zaslavsky was a young exchange student who arrived at the University of California in 1987. "My first night in America, my host took me to a place called Lucky's," he recalled in a 2012 interview. "I thought it was a special store for privileged people. I kept asking, who was allowed to shop here?" He couldn't understand my question. "Anyone," he said. I didn't believe him. Zaslavsky was assigned a research project to understand American food distribution. He visited farms, warehouses, distribution centers, and many more supermarkets. I was looking for the catch, for the propaganda trick. Where were they hiding the shortages? Where were the special stores for the Communist Party members of America? There had to be scarcity somewhere. Eventually, Zaslavsky realized there was no trick. The abundance was real and widely available. When he returned to Moscow and told friends about American supermarkets, many accused him of falling for capitalist propaganda. They thought I had been brainwashed, he said. It was easier to believe that than to question everything we had been taught about our system being superior. For Soviet officials visiting America, such encounters could be professionally risky. Acknowledging American abundance might be construed as criticism of the Soviet system. Many limited their remarks to technical observations or focused on inequalities in American society. The fact that some Americans couldn't afford the plenty they saw in stores, or that poverty existed amid such wealth. Georgy Arbatov, founder of the Soviet Union's Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies and a close advisor to 5 Soviet leaders, managed delegations to America from the 1960s to the 1980s. He later described how carefully officials navigated these visits. We were trained to look for unemployment, for homeless people, for signs that this wealth was built on exploitation. And those things existed, of course, but the scale and availability of consumer goods couldn't be denied. So we emphasized other Soviet advantages: guaranteed employment, free health care, subsidized housing. Not all officials were so cautious in private. Mikhail Poltoranin, who would later become Boris Yeltsin's press minister, accompanied a delegation of regional Soviet officials to Chicago in 1987. After seeing that city's food stores, our mayors and party chiefs were nearly suicidal, he recalled. They kept asking the same question: why can't we do this? What would it take us? But they understood that the gap was so wide that catching up seemed impossible. For ordinary Soviet citizens, these revelations were equally shocking, but less politically fraught. Victoria Tokareva, a writer who visited New York in 1989 as part of a cultural delegation, wrote about her first supermarket experience in a samizdat, underground publication. The abundance, The sheer number of options for a single product like cheese or coffee, it made me feel physical pain. Not because I coveted these things, but because I suddenly understood that our entire system of values was built on a lie. The American supermarket's impact wasn't just about quantity, it was about choice. Soviet stores typically offered a single type of cheese, one kind of milk, standard issue bread. When products were available at all, there were no brands to choose between. State planning determined production, not consumer preference. Esther Fine, Moscow correspondent for the New York Times from 1986 to 1991, followed Soviet delegations visiting American supermarkets. They were overwhelmed by choice, she observed. Having 30 different breakfast cereals seemed wasteful and confusing to them at first. But then they'd start to ask, why don't we have any options? Not 30, but why not even 2 or 3? The concept of marketing was equally foreign. Soviet products came in utilitarian packaging with straightforward names: butter, cheese, meat. American products, with their colorful packaging, brand identities, and advertising claims, seemed like an alien language. Some visitors found it excessive and manipulative. Others were fascinated by the psychology of consumer capitalism. Alexander Guinness, a Russian writer who emigrated to America in 1977, described the supermarket as America's secret weapon in the Cold War. In his essays, he noted how Soviet visitors would marvel at technologies that Americans took for granted: barcode scanners, shopping carts with child seats, refrigerated displays, self-service scales for produce. By the late 1980s, Soviet journalists stationed in the United States began writing more candidly about American consumer culture. Vladimir Posner, who reported for Soviet television from New York, produced segments showing American supermarkets. These reports were carefully framed, emphasizing that not all Americans could afford such bounty, but still revealed a level of everyday prosperity that contradicted decades of Soviet messaging. Such reports had limited reach, however. Most Soviet citizens still had no direct exposure to Western living standards. Their understanding came through officially approved media, occasional smuggled Western magazines, and word of mouth from the fortunate few who had traveled abroad. This changed dramatically with Gorbachev's glasnost reforms, which allowed Soviet media to discuss previously taboo subjects, including the country's economic failings. Suddenly, comparative standard of living discussions became possible. Publications like Ogonyok and Moscow News began publishing articles questioning why the Soviet economy couldn't produce consumer goods with the quality and variety found in the West. By 1989, the gap between Soviet promises and Soviet reality had become the subject of open discourse. The myth of Soviet economic superiority, or even parity, with the West could no longer be maintained. As Soviet citizens became more aware of living standards elsewhere, their patience with chronic shortages waned. This erosion of confidence coincided with worsening economic conditions. Ironically, Gorbachev's reforms had disrupted the command economy without yet establishing functioning market mechanisms. The result was the worst of both worlds. The old system of distribution collapsed, while new supply chains had not yet formed. By 1989, sugar, soap, and cigarettes were rationed in Moscow. In other regions, the situation was far worse. Against this backdrop, the trickle of first-person accounts about American abundance became increasingly potent. They were no longer abstract comparisons, but vivid contradictions to daily Soviet reality. As lines grew longer and store shelves emptier, stories about American supermarkets transformed from curiosities into indictments. Perhaps no single supermarket encounter had greater historical significance than the one experienced by Boris Yeltsin in September 1989. Yeltsin, then newly elected to the Supreme Soviet and a rising political star, was visiting the United States to give lectures on Soviet politics. His Houston hosts, wanting to show him everyday American life, took him to a suburban Randall's supermarket. According to biographer Leon Oren, Yeltsin was more impressed by the store than by anything else he saw in America. He roamed the aisles, gazing at the array of meats and fish, cheese and produce, frozen foods, and baked goods. The experience, Aaron writes, was shattering for him, collapsing his whole view of socialism. When I saw those shelves crammed with hundreds, thousands of cans, cartons, and goods of every possible sort, for the first time I felt quite frankly sick with despair for the Soviet people, Yeltsin wrote in his autobiography, Against the Grain. That such a potentially super-rich country as ours has been brought to a state of such poverty, it is terrible to think of it. Yeltsin's reaction wasn't unique, but his political position gave it outsized importance. When he returned to Moscow, he was a changed man, according to those close to him. His criticisms of the Soviet system became more pointed, his calls for radical reform more urgent. 2 years later, he would stand atop a tank in Moscow to resist a hardline coup attempt against Gorbachev. Months after that, he would preside over the dissolution of the Soviet Union and become the first president of an independent Russia. How much did that supermarket visit influence these momentous events? Historians debate the question. Yeltsin himself gave it significant weight in his memoirs, writing that seeing ordinary Americans' standard of living deepened his conviction that the Soviet system had failed its people. While this may be retrospective simplification of complex political calculations, the emotional impact of the visit seems genuine. Similar encounters affected other Soviet elites. Gennady Burbulis, who would become Yeltsin's right-hand man during the Soviet collapse, visited California in early 1990. He later claimed that seeing supermarkets there convinced him that incremental reform of the Soviet system was impossible. Only a complete break with communist economics could deliver prosperity. Alexander Yakovlev, one of Gorbachev's closest advisors and a key architect of perestroika, had spent 10 years as Soviet ambassador to Canada in the 1970s. His exposure to North American living standards during that time profoundly influenced his thinking. The gap was so obvious, he later said, that continuing to pretend we were building a superior society became impossible for anyone who had seen the alternative. For ordinary Soviet visitors, American supermarkets represented something simpler, but no less powerful: the failure of their system to deliver on its most basic promises. While capitalism's critics could point to its inequalities, environmental costs, and spiritual emptiness, they couldn't deny its productive capacity. Olga Kamenchuk, a social psychologist who interviewed numerous Soviet citizens who traveled to the West in the late 1980s, found that food abundance was consistently mentioned as the most shocking aspect of their visits. They expected to see military technology, impressive architecture, wealth in certain districts, she explained. But the everyday nature of American prosperity, the fact that regular people had access to such variety and quality of food, this they weren't prepared for. The psychological impact extended beyond envy or material desire. Many visitors described feeling deceived not just by their government, but by a lifetime of education and propaganda. The cognitive dissonance could be profound. Some rejected what they saw, insisting it must be staged or atypical. Others incorporated it into existing worldviews. Yes, America had consumer goods, but at the cost of spiritual emptiness or exploitation of the Third World. For a significant number, however, these encounters forced a fundamental reevaluation. If the Soviet system couldn't match the West in something as basic as food distribution, despite possessing vast agricultural lands and educated population, and 7 decades of socialist planning, perhaps the entire project was fundamentally flawed. By early 1990, this sentiment had spread far beyond those who had personally visited Western countries. Through word of mouth, increasingly candid media coverage, and the visible frustration of Soviet elites, awareness of the prosperity gap permeated Soviet society. As historian Vladislav Zubok notes, The legitimacy of the Soviet system had rested partly on the promise of eventual abundance. When citizens realized how far they remained from that goal and how easily capitalism had achieved it, the moral foundation of the regime crumbled. This realization coincided with other crisis points: ethnic tensions in Soviet republics, the collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and mounting economic problems at home. Together, these pressures made the system's continuation untenable. In the spring of 1989, the first McDonald's opened in Moscow to enormous lines and international media attention. For many Muscovites, it offered their first taste of American-style service and efficiency. Though expensive by local standards, it provided a glimpse of what market economics could deliver. Workers smiled. Food arrived quickly. Nothing was in short supply. That same year, Pizza Hut entered the Soviet market, followed by other Western food companies. Each new opening generated massive interest, not just for the novelty, but because these establishments offered reliability in an increasingly unreliable economy. Meanwhile, Soviet consumers faced worsening conditions. By 1990, rationing had expanded to most basic goods in many regions. Even Moscow's relatively privileged residents spent hours daily in queues. Rural areas faced severe hardships, with deliveries of sugar, meat, and dairy products becoming irregular or non-existent. In this context, stories about American supermarkets took on near-mythic qualities. They represented not just material abundance, but a different way of living, one without the daily humiliations of Soviet consumer culture, the queues, the rudeness of clerks, the endless hunting for basic necessities. As winter approached in 1990, food shortages in Soviet cities reached critical levels. The government, desperate to prevent unrest, accepted humanitarian aid from former adversaries. American chicken legs, nicknamed bush legs after the U.S. president, began appearing in Soviet stores. For a population raised on stories of Soviet agricultural achievement, accepting food aid from the capitalist enemy represented a profound psychological defeat. It was against this backdrop that the most senior Soviet officials were still traveling to America and experiencing its abundance firsthand. Yuri Maslyukov, chairman of Gosplan, the state planning committee, visited the United States in late 1990. As the man ultimately responsible for the Soviet economy, his reaction to American prosperity was telling. According to aides present, he returned to Moscow in a state of deep pessimism, telling colleagues, "We have lost the economic competition. It's not even close." Even Soviet intelligence agencies, whose reports on American society had long emphasized its problems rather than its successes, began producing more balanced assessments. Kerbo. Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov complained in a November 1990 speech that some of his analysts had become too impressed with Western living standards and were losing sight of capitalism's contradictions. By 1991, the gap between Soviet promises and Soviet reality had become impossible to ignore. When hardcore communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev in August of that year, they found little popular support. Their vision, a return to orthodox Soviet economics and politics, offered no solution to the country's material deprivation. Instead, it was Boris Yeltsin, standing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building, who captured the moment. His promise of rapid transition to a market economy, explicitly modeled on Western prosperity, resonated with a population tired of shortages and broken promises. 4 months later, the Soviet hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, replaced by 15 independent states, each embarking on its own path toward market economics. The transition proved far more difficult than many had anticipated. In Russia, Yeltsin's shock therapy economic reforms produced hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and the rise of oligarchic capitalism. For millions of ordinary citizens, the 1990s brought not prosperity, but deeper poverty and uncertainty. Yet even as economic conditions worsened for many, the consumer landscape transformed. Russian cities soon boasted their own supermarkets, initially stocked with imported goods few could afford. Western products, once rare status symbols, became increasingly common. The problem was no longer availability, but affordability. For the generation that had stood in Soviet queues, these changes represented a revolution in daily life, albeit one with sharply unequal benefits. The elderly and those in remote regions often found themselves worse off, while the young and urban could access consumer opportunities their parents never imagined. 30 years after those first wide-eyed Soviet delegations wandered American supermarket aisles, the legacy of those encounters remains complex. Did American consumer abundance win the Cold War? The reality, like most historical causation, is more nuanced. Military competition, technological backwardness, ethnic tensions, and the inherent contradictions of authoritarian socialism all contributed to the Soviet collapse. Yet the role of consumer desires and the Soviet system's failure to satisfy them cannot be dismissed. As historian Stephen Kotkin observes, in the end, the Soviet elite and a critical mass of the Soviet population had come to measure their system's legitimacy by its ability to deliver consumer goods. By that standard, the system had undeniably failed. As winter descended upon Moscow in December 1991, the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, prepared to address his nation one final time. The Cold War was ending not with nuclear holocaust, but with the quiet dissolution of an empire. Among the many complex factors that had brought this moment to pass, one seems deceptively simple. The sight of fully stocked grocery shelves, thousands of miles away, had helped convince enough people, from ordinary citizens to the highest officials, that their system had failed to deliver on its most basic promises. In the days that followed, as Russians adjusted to post-Soviet reality, many found themselves standing in lines once again, this time at the first foreign grocery chains opening in major cities. The shelves held products most couldn't yet afford, but the symbol was powerful. The possibility of abundance had arrived, even if its equal distribution remained elusive. The journey that had begun with those first wide-eyed Soviet delegations in American supermarkets had come full circle, though its ultimate destination remained uncertain. As dawn broke over the new Russian Federation in January 1992, citizens awakened to a transformed economic landscape. Price controls, the bedrock of Soviet consumer economics for 70 years, had been eliminated overnight. The policy known as shock therapy was designed to rapidly transition from central planning to market economics. It was championed by Yegor Gaidar, the young economist appointed by President Yeltsin to remake the Russian economy in capitalism's image. Inspired partly by what he had seen during his own visits to Western supermarkets, Gaidar believed that unleashing market forces would quickly generate the kind of consumer abundance that had so impressed Soviet visitors to America. The immediate results were catastrophic for most citizens. Prices rose by 250% in the first month alone. Life savings evaporated. Basic necessities became unaffordable for pensioners and state employees. The promised cornucopia of goods appeared in newly privatized stores, but few could afford them. "We finally have American supermarkets," went a bitter Russian joke from 1992, but now we need American salaries to shop in them. For many Russians, especially the elderly who had sacrificed through decades of Soviet promises that socialism would eventually deliver prosperity, the transition was cruelly ironic. They had endured wartime rationing, post-war reconstruction, and the perpetual shortages of the Brezhnev era, always believing that their sacrifices were building a better future. Now in their final years, they watched as abundance finally appeared, tantalizingly visible, but financially out of reach. Yet, despite the hardships, few advocated returning to the Soviet system. The memory of empty shelves, endless queues, and the petty humiliations of the shortage economy remained too fresh. A new consumer culture was emerging, initially accessible only to the nascent business class and those with connections to the rapid privatization of state assets. By mid-decade, however, the first truly Russian supermarket chains had appeared, offering domestic and imported products with increasing affordability. For former Soviet officials who had witnessed American abundance firsthand, the transition presented profound personal and philosophical challenges. Some, like Yeltsin, embraced market reforms with revolutionary zeal, determined to replicate what they had seen in the West. Others retreated into nationalist positions, arguing that Russia should find its own path rather than importing Western economic models wholesale. Gennady Zyuganov, who reconstituted the Communist Party of the Russian Federation after the Soviet collapse, acknowledged the failure of the Soviet consumer economy but argued that Russia had taken the worst aspects of capitalism without the social protections. His party advocated a mixed economy that would preserve universal benefits while allowing market mechanisms to generate consumer goods. Even committed reformers like Anatoly Chubais, who oversaw Russia's massive privatization program, eventually conceded that the transition had been more traumatic than necessary. "We were in such a hurry to bury communism," he reflected in a 1997 interview, "that we didn't pay enough attention to the social costs." Meanwhile, former Soviet republics pursued different paths toward market economics with varying degrees of success. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania embraced Western economic models most enthusiastically and achieved the most rapid improvements in living standards. By the early 2000s, their supermarkets rivaled those in Western Europe. Central Asian republics maintained more state control, while Ukraine oscillated between Western and Russian economic orientations. Throughout the former Soviet space, however, the psychological impact of exposure to Western consumer culture continued to reverberate. Generations raised on scarcity now navigated a world of choice, albeit one where economic inequality determined who could exercise that choice. For those who had directly experienced American supermarkets in the 1980s, the memory remained powerful. Nina Khrushcheva, great-granddaughter of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and herself a Soviet citizen until emigrating in 1991, described how those visits shaped an entire generation's worldview. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The abundance wasn't just about having more things, it was about having more possibilities, more freedom to shape your daily life. This connection between consumer choice and broader freedoms became a central theme in post-Soviet politics. Vladimir Putin, who rose to power in 2000 after a decade of economic turbulence, tacitly offered Russians a new social contract, political stability, and national pride in exchange for improving living standards and consumer opportunities. Under Putin's leadership, the Russian economy stabilized, helped by rising oil prices. A genuine middle class emerged in major cities with disposable income for previously inaccessible goods and services. Western-style shopping malls and supermarket chains proliferated. By the mid-2000s, Moscow boasted luxury boutiques and gourmet food stores that rivaled those in Paris or London, though such amenities remained concentrated in wealthier urban areas, with rural regions still lagging far behind. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 temporarily threatened this progress, but recovery came relatively quickly. By 2013, the average Muscovite enjoyed consumer opportunities unimaginable to previous generations. Food variety, quality, and availability had transformed completely from the Soviet era. Even in smaller cities, chain supermarkets offered thousands of products, loyalty cards, and modern conveniences. Yet this consumer revolution came with distinctly Russian characteristics. Domestically produced goods competed alongside imports. Soviet-era brands were revived with updated packaging and marketing. Customer service improved dramatically but retained certain cultural differences from Western norms, and state intervention in the economy remained significantly higher than in the United States or Western Europe. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, resulting Western sanctions and counter-sanctions reshaped the consumer landscape once again. Imported European cheeses, fruits, and meats disappeared from shelves. The government promoted import substitution, encouraging domestic production to replace sanctioned goods. Some Russians complained about declining quality and variety, while others embraced economic nationalism, seeing the return to locally produced food as healthier and more authentic. Throughout these transformations, the memory of those first encounters with American abundance remained a cultural touchstone. Books, films, and television programs revisited the moment when Soviet citizens first glimpsed the consumer cornucopia of the West. These narratives often contained a mix of nostalgia, irony, and reflection on the complex legacy of both Soviet deprivation and post-Soviet transition. Svetlana Boym, a cultural historian who emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1981, noted how these memories evolved over time. In the 1990s, Russians talked about American supermarkets as symbols of what they aspired to create. By the 2000s, they had become reference points for measuring Russia's progress. And by the 2010s, they were reinterpreted through the lens of national identity. Yes, they have more choice, but our food tastes better. This evolution reflected broader shifts in Russian attitudes toward the West. The initial post-Soviet admiration gave way to more complex feelings, including disappointment that adopting market economics hadn't automatically produced Western living standards, resentment at perceived Western condescension, and renewed pride in Russian distinctiveness. Similar patterns played out across the former Soviet space, with local variations. In Ukraine, the Orange Revolution of 2004-2005 and the Euromaidan protests of 2013-2014 explicitly connected European integration with aspirations for Western-style prosperity. In Central Asia, authoritarian regimes embraced certain aspects of consumer capitalism while maintaining tight political control. In the Baltic states, EU membership accelerated their transformation into consumer societies indistinguishable from Western Europe. The Soviet visitors who had marveled at American supermarkets in the 1980s were now senior citizens watching these transformations from the perspective of experience. Many expressed mixed feelings about the path their countries had taken. They appreciated the end of shortages and queues, but questioned whether materialistic consumer culture represented true progress. Leonid Brezhnev, who ruled the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death in 1982, had promised citizens developed socialism with rising living standards. Instead, the 1970s and early 1980s brought economic stagnation, with consumer goods perpetually in short supply despite official statistics claiming continuous economic growth. This contradiction between the promised prosperity of socialism and the visible reality of everyday scarcity created fertile ground for the impact of Western abundance when Soviet citizens finally encountered it. Soviet propaganda had long depicted American society as deeply unequal, with extreme wealth alongside extreme poverty. This portrait wasn't entirely false. America did and does have significant economic inequality, but it failed to capture the mass affluence that characterized American middle-class life by the 1980s, when Soviet visitors saw that ordinary Americans, not just elites, had access to abundant food and consumer goods. It contradicted their foundational understanding of capitalism. The concept of the supermarket itself embodied fundamental differences between the two economic systems. In the Soviet Union, food shopping typically required visiting multiple specialized stores: a bread store, a meat store, a dairy store, a produce store. Each might have lines, limited selection, and unpredictable inventory. The American supermarket, with its one-stop shopping, self-service model, and consistent supply, represented not just abundance, but efficiency and customer-centered design. Even the physical experience differed dramatically. Soviet stores were often cramped, poorly lit, and minimally decorated. Products sat behind counters, requiring interaction with frequently brusque clerks. American supermarkets offered wide aisles, bright lighting, background music, and direct access to products. These seemingly superficial differences communicated deeper messages about the relationship between the state, the economy, and the citizen consumer. Language reflected these divergent approaches. In Soviet Russian, people spoke of obtaining dostat, goods, rather than simply buying them. The verb implied effort, connections, and luck, all required elements of Soviet shopping. One didn't just purchase sugar, one obtained it after standing in line or through a personal connection. The concept of shopping as leisure or pleasure, common in American consumer culture, was largely foreign to Soviet citizens. The most profound difference lay in the role of choice. The Soviet system emphasized access over selection, ensuring that all citizens could afford basic necessities but offering minimal variety. American consumer capitalism prioritized choice, even if it meant some citizens might struggle to afford basic versions of products while others could select premium options. These different priorities reflected deeper ideological commitments about equality, freedom, and the proper relationship between the individual and society. When Soviet visitors encountered American supermarkets, they weren't just seeing more food. They were experiencing an entirely different concept of the consumer's role in society. This realization raised uncomfortable questions. If capitalism could provide both abundance and choice, what was the justification for socialism's material sacrifices? If consumer satisfaction wasn't an inherent weakness of capitalism, but one of its strengths, how should socialist economies respond? Gorbachev's reforms attempted to answer these questions by introducing limited market mechanisms while maintaining central planning and state ownership. This third way ultimately proved unsustainable. As historian Stephen Kotkin notes, the Soviet system could either be reformed or preserved, but not both simultaneously. The contradictions became too great, especially as citizens became more aware of alternatives. For Soviet leaders who visited the West, these contradictions created significant cognitive dissonance. Georgy Arbatov, a top Soviet Americanist who advised multiple Soviet leaders, later admitted, "We would come back from America and report on their economic problems, their social inequalities, their racial tensions, all of which were real. But we would omit or downplay their extraordinary productive capacity and standard of living because acknowledging these would raise too many difficult questions about our own system, as glasnost allowed more honest discussion of Soviet economic problems. This selective reporting became untenable." By 1989-1990, Soviet media began acknowledging the prosperity gap more directly. This coincided with worsening shortages, creating a perfect storm of rising expectations and deteriorating conditions. The Soviet collapse that followed wasn't simply caused by consumer discontent, military overextension, nationalist movements in the republics, and elite fragmentation of it all played crucial roles. But the failure to deliver the material prosperity long promised by socialist ideology undermined the system's legitimacy at a critical moment. In the aftermath, post-Soviet states embraced consumer capitalism with varying degrees of enthusiasm and success. The initial transition brought what Russians call dikий capitalism, wild capitalism, unregulated markets, extreme inequality, and the rapid privatization of state assets at fire sale prices. The economic suffering was widespread and severe. Between 1991 and 1998, Russia's GDP declined by around 40%, an economic contraction comparable to the Great Depression in the United States. For many citizens, the promised prosperity of capitalism seemed as elusive as the promised abundance of socialism had been. The bitter joke from the early 1990s, "Everything the communists told us about communism was a lie, but everything they told us about capitalism was true," captured this disillusionment. Yet by the early 2000s, the consumer landscape had transformed dramatically across much of the former Soviet space. The emergence of a genuine middle class in Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states created demand for consumer goods beyond basic necessities. Shopping malls, hypermarkets, and specialty stores proliferated. International brands established local operations. A generation born after the Soviet collapse grew up taking consumer choice for granted, unable to imagine the world their parents had known. This transformation occurred unevenly, however. Major cities modernized rapidly, while rural areas and smaller towns often retained elements of the Soviet-era retail environment. Economic inequality meant that consumer opportunities varied widely among social classes. The geography of consumption became a visible map of post-Soviet social stratification. For foreign visitors to Russia in the 2010s, Moscow's upscale grocery stores offered surprises of their own. Massive food halls like Yelisevsky, established in pre-revolutionary times and recently renovated, and Danilovsky Market showcased both international products and distinctly Russian delicacies. The stereotype of Russian food deprivation, formed during Soviet times, had become obsolete, at least in major urban centers. The reactions of Soviet visitors to American supermarkets hadn't simply been about food, however. They reflected deeper questions about economic systems, government priorities, and quality of life. As post-Soviet societies developed their own versions of consumer capitalism, these questions remained relevant. What should a society optimize for? Material abundance? Equal access? Environmental sustainability? Cultural authenticity? Alexander Guinness, a Russian-American writer who has documented Soviet encounters with Western consumer culture, observed that these visits forced Soviet citizens to confront not just what they didn't have, but what they didn't know they could have. The experience revealed not only material deprivation, but conceptual limitations, the narrowness of what had been imagined as possible. This expanded sense of possibility ultimately proved more transformative than the specific products Soviet visitors observed. When Boris Yeltsin stood in that Houston supermarket in 1989, he wasn't just seeing food. He was glimpsing an alternative reality, one where the economy served consumer desires rather than state priorities. Ironically, the Soviet Union had itself once promised a utopian abundance. Early Bolshevik visions included not only the elimination of hunger and want, but the creation of prosperity beyond anything capitalism could deliver. The revolutionary Alexandra Kollontai had imagined communal dining halls offering better meals than any restaurant. The poet Vladimir Mayakovsky foresaw a communist future where the streets will be our dining tables, the boulevards our living rooms. By the 1980s, these grand visions had contracted to the modest goal of providing enough sausage, in the words of one Soviet official. Even this limited aspiration proved unattainable. The system designed to transcend capitalism's material limitations ended up unable to match its productive capacity, let alone surpass it. This failure had deep historical roots. After the 1917 revolution, the Soviet leadership prioritized heavy industry and military production over consumer goods. This emphasis intensified during Stalin's industrialization drives of the 1930s and again during post-World War II reconstruction. Consumer needs were consistently deferred in favor of industrial development, defense spending, and international commitments. Even during the relative prosperity of the Khrushchev years, 1953-1964, when living standards improved significantly, Soviet consumer culture remained constrained by ideology. Khrushchev's famous kitchen debate with Nixon revealed a leader who believed that socialism's strength lay not in providing consumer choice, but in guaranteeing basic necessities for all, a fundamentally different conception of prosperity. By the Brezhnev era, 1964-1982, consumer expectations had risen, but the system's ability to meet them stagnated. Rising oil prices temporarily masked structural economic problems, allowing for modest improvements in living standards through imported goods. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, these problems could no longer be hidden. Gorbachev inherited this troubled legacy, an economy unable to satisfy rising consumer demands and falling further behind Western living standards. His reforms attempted to preserve socialism while incorporating elements of market economics. This inherently contradictory project ultimately hastened the system's collapse rather than revitalizing it. The Soviet visitors who experienced American supermarkets in the 1980s thus witnessed not just a different retail environment, but the endpoint of divergent historical paths taken after World War II. Both superpowers had emerged from the war with devastated economies, but contrasting approaches to reconstruction. The United States emphasized consumer prosperity as both an economic engine and an ideological statement. The Soviet Union prioritized heavy industry, military might, and the needs of the state over individual consumption. By the 1980s, these different priorities had produced dramatically different results. American supermarkets, with their overwhelming abundance and choice, stood as physical embodiments of capitalism's productive capacity. Soviet stores, with their limited selections and frequent shortages, represented the compromises and failures of central planning. When Soviet citizens encountered this contrast directly, it challenged not just their material expectations, but their ideological understanding of the world. The Cold War had been framed as a competition between systems with different but equally valid priorities. The supermarket experiences suggested that one system was simply better at delivering what it promised, at least in the realm of consumer goods. This realization didn't necessarily translate into a wholesale rejection of socialist values. Many Soviet visitors maintained their commitments to social equality, universal education, and health care while acknowledging capitalism's superior productive capacity. Others embraced market economics more fully, seeing consumer prosperity as inseparable from broader political and economic freedoms. Mikhail Gorbachev himself never abandoned his belief in socialism, even as his reforms unintentionally hastened its demise in the Soviet Union. In his 1987 book, Perestroika, he wrote about the need to create socialism with a human face, a system that would combine social guarantees with greater economic efficiency and responsiveness to consumer needs. The rapid shift from Soviet scarcity to post-Soviet abundance, albeit unequally distributed, created its own cultural dissonances. Older generations, accustomed to saving and reusing everything, sometimes struggled to adapt to a culture of disposability and constant consumption. The skills that had been essential in the shortage economy, knowing which stores might have supplies, maintaining networks of connections, improvising substitutes for unavailable goods, suddenly became obsolete. Meanwhile, younger post-Soviet citizens embraced consumer culture enthusiastically, sometimes to the dismay of their elders. Shopping emerged as a leisure activity rather than a necessary chore. Brand consciousness developed rapidly. Western marketing techniques found receptive audiences in societies eager for novelty after decades of limited choices. The psychological aspects of this transition were complex. For some, especially the elderly, the sudden appearance of previously unobtainable goods created feelings of bitterness. Why had they spent decades standing in lines when abundance was apparently achievable all along? For others, particularly those who successfully navigated the new economic landscape, consumer opportunities represented welcome freedom from the constraints of the past. These varied responses reflected different interpretations of the Soviet experience itself. Was it a noble experiment undermined by external pressures and internal mistakes? A fundamentally flawed system doomed from the beginning? A necessary stage of development that prepared the ground for something better? The answer shaped how individuals viewed the consumer transformation that followed. By the 2010s, these questions had become less urgent for most citizens of post-Soviet states. A new generation had grown up with no personal memory of Soviet shopping. For them, consumer capitalism wasn't a dramatic rupture, but simply the world they had always known. Their understanding of the Soviet period came through family stories, historical education, and increasingly nostalgic popular culture. This generational shift coincided with growing criticism of consumer capitalism itself, both within post-Soviet societies and globally. Environmental concerns, critiques of economic inequality, and questions about the psychological impacts of consumer culture gained traction. Some of these critiques echoed Soviet-era critiques of Western materialism, now divorced from their original ideological context. Vladimir Putin's Russia exemplified these contradictions. While embracing consumer capitalism and integrating into global markets, official rhetoric increasingly emphasized traditional values, national distinctiveness, and criticism of Western excesses. This stance resonated with many Russians who had grown disillusioned with the initial post-Soviet embrace of all things Western. The 2014 sanctions following Russia's annexation of Crimea accelerated this trend. Government officials promoted import substitution as both an economic necessity and a patriotic duty. Domestic producers expanded to fill gaps left by banned Western products. Russian consumers adjusted to a somewhat narrower range of choices, though nothing approaching Soviet-era scarcity. Food, in particular, became politicized. State media celebrated traditional Russian agricultural products while questioning the quality and safety of Western imports. The disappearance of European cheeses and other delicacies from store shelves was framed not as deprivation, but as an opportunity to rediscover superior local alternatives. This nationalization of consumer culture represented a significant evolution from the initial post-Soviet period, when Western products were automatically assumed to be superior. It reflected both genuine development of domestic industries and strategic repositioning in response to geopolitical tensions. Similar processes occurred across the former Soviet space, with local variations. Ukraine's consumer landscape became increasingly European-oriented following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, with products and retail formats deliberately distinguished from Russian models. Central Asian republics developed hybrid consumer cultures, incorporating Russian, Western, and local influences. The Baltic states fully integrated into European consumer patterns. Throughout these transformations, the memory of those initial Soviet encounters with American abundance retained symbolic power. They marked a historical inflection point, the moment when the material gap between capitalism and socialism became undeniable, even to those most committed to the latter. For the individuals who experienced these encounters, the impact was often deeply personal. Irene Stevenson, an American who hosted Soviet delegations in Washington during the late 1980s, recalled taking one group to a suburban giant supermarket. One delegate, a middle-aged woman, started crying in the produce section. She kept touching the fruits, asking if they were real. When I assured her they were, she said, "My mother stood in lines all her life. She died last year. She never saw anything like this." Such emotional reactions weren't universal. Some Soviet visitors, particularly those with strong ideological commitments, found ways to contextualize or minimize what they saw. They emphasized homelessness in American cities, racial inequalities, or the psychological emptiness they perceived in consumer culture. These critiques weren't entirely wrong. American society did, and does, have significant problems alongside its material abundance. Others focused on technical explanations, noting America's more favorable climate for agriculture, its historical development without the devastation of 2 world wars on its territory, or its different geographic challenges. These factors were real, but they couldn't fully explain the prosperity gap that had developed between the superpowers. The most thoughtful Soviet observers recognized that the differences they witnessed reflected not just economic systems, but deeper cultural and philosophical divergences. Tatiana Tolstaya, a Russian writer who first visited America in the late 1980s, noted that Soviet stores weren't just inefficient, they embodied a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between citizen and state. "In America, the consumer is king," she wrote. "In the Soviet Union, the consumer is a supplicant, grateful for whatever the system provides." This distinction went beyond economics to touch on dignity, agency, and the nature of citizenship itself. As post-Soviet states developed their own versions of consumer capitalism, they navigated these philosophical questions in different ways. Some embraced the American model of customer service and consumer sovereignty. Others retained elements of the more hierarchical Soviet approach. Most created hybrid systems, reflecting both their Soviet legacy and their new market orientation. The physical environment of shopping itself transformed dramatically. Soviet stores had typically been small, with limited assortments displayed behind counters. The transition to self-service supermarkets, with open shelving, shopping carts, and checkout lanes, represented not just a change in retail format, but a fundamental shift in trust and agency. Consumers could now touch products before purchasing, compare options directly, and move at their own pace rather than being dependent on sales clerks. This shift mirrored broader social changes as post-Soviet societies moved from authoritarian to more democratic structures, albeit with significant variations, and, in some cases, subsequent reversals. The citizen consumer gained greater autonomy, but also shouldered more responsibility for their choices. The paternalistic aspects of the Soviet system, while restrictive, had also provided certain forms of security and guidance that disappeared in the transition. By the 2020s, 3 decades after the Soviet collapse, the consumer landscapes of post-Soviet states had diversified significantly. Russia's major cities featured sophisticated retail environments comparable to Western Europe, while smaller towns and rural areas maintained more traditional shopping patterns. Ukraine's consumer culture increasingly oriented toward Europe, especially in Western regions. Belarus preserved more elements of the Soviet approach, with greater state involvement in retail and distribution. Central Asian republics developed distinctive consumer environments reflecting their cultural and economic situations. Throughout this diversity, certain common patterns emerged. Nearly everywhere, the one-time Soviet citizen had been transformed into a consumer with choices unimaginable to previous generations. Shopping had evolved from a necessary struggle to obtain basic goods into a complex social activity involving brand identity, lifestyle choices, and self-expression. This transformation came with costs as well as benefits. Consumer debt, environmental impacts, and commercialization of previously non-commercial spheres of life emerged as concerns across the region. The social solidarity that had sometimes developed through shared sacrifice in the shortage economy gave way to more individualistic approaches to consumption and identity. For the generation that had experienced both systems, these changes prompted reflection on what had been gained and lost in the transition. Material abundance had arrived, but had it brought the fulfillment and social harmony once promised by both communist and capitalist ideologies? The ultimate historical significance of Soviet encounters with American supermarkets lies not in their direct causation of the Soviet collapse, which had multiple complex causes, but in their symbolic encapsulation of the system's fundamental contradictions. They represented moments when ideology confronted reality and found itself wanting. When Boris Yeltsin stood in that Houston supermarket in 1989, visibly shaken by what he saw, he experienced a moment of clarity that would help shape the subsequent course of history. The system he had served his entire career was failing at its most basic task, feeding its people adequately. The alternative he witnessed wasn't just different. It was, by the standards most meaningful to ordinary citizens, demonstrably superior. 2 years later, as the Soviet Union dissolved and Yeltsin became president of an independent Russia, he embraced market reforms with revolutionary fervor, determined to bring Western-style prosperity to his country. The path proved far more difficult than he had anticipated. Economic shock therapy created widespread suffering. The privatization of state assets enriched a small class of oligarchs while impoverishing millions. The democratic institutions that were supposed to accompany market economics remained fragile and underdeveloped. By the time Yeltsin resigned on December 31, 1999, handing power to Vladimir Putin, many Russians had grown disillusioned with both market economics and Western-style democracy. The abundance they had glimpsed in American supermarkets had arrived, but not in the form they had expected or for the benefit of all. Putin's Russia took a different approach, combining market economics with strong state control and nationalist rhetoric. Consumer prosperity improved significantly during his first 2 terms, 2000-2008, helping secure his popularity despite growing authoritarianism. The global financial crisis, falling oil prices, and post-2014 sanctions created economic challenges, but Russia's consumer economy remained fundamentally transformed from the Soviet era. Similar patterns played out across the former Soviet space with local variations. Everywhere, the promise of consumer abundance that had so impressed Soviet visitors to American supermarkets became central to post-Soviet legitimacy. Governments might restrict political freedoms, but they understood that empty store shelves could threaten their survival. This political calculus reflected a fundamental shift in the social contract. Soviet citizens had accepted material limitations in exchange for social guarantees and the promise of future abundance. Post-Soviet citizens expected material prosperity in the present, even if it came with new forms of insecurity and inequality. The visual contrast between Soviet and American food shopping remained a powerful historical symbol. Photographs of barren Soviet shelves alongside cornucopian American supermarkets became standard illustrations in books about the Cold War. These images simplified a complex history but captured something essential about the competing systems and their ultimate trajectories. For those who experienced both worlds firsthand, the memories remain vivid. Svetlana Alexievich, Nobel Prize-winning chronicler of post-Soviet life, collected testimonies from ordinary citizens about this transition. One middle-aged woman told her, "I remember my first trip to a Finnish supermarket in 1992. I walked through the aisles touching everything, afraid someone would stop me. When I returned to St. Petersburg, I couldn't sleep for 3 nights. I kept thinking, was it all a lie? Everything we sacrificed, everything we believed, for what?" Such existential questions haunted the post-Soviet transition. The answers remain complex and contested, shaped by individual experiences, generational perspectives, and ongoing developments in Russia and beyond. What remains clear is that those Soviet encounters with American supermarkets in the 1980s represented more than mere consumer envy. They were moments when two worldviews collided, and the resulting fissures helped reshape the geopolitical landscape of the late 20th century. Today, as new forms of great power competition emerge and economic systems continue to evolve, these historical encounters offer valuable perspective. They remind us that abstract ideological claims ultimately face the test of everyday reality. Systems are judged not just by their stated principles, but by their ability to deliver tangible improvements in ordinary lives, and even the most seemingly mundane aspects of daily life, like grocery shopping, can carry profound political and historical significance. The Soviet visitors who stood amazed in American supermarket aisles during the Cold War's final decade were witnessing not just food abundance, but the beginning of the end of a 70-year experiment. The full meaning of that moment continues to unfold in the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the former Soviet space, in the global economic order that emerged after the Cold War, and in ongoing debates about consumption, prosperity, and human flourishing in the 21st century.